In the spring of 1994, a man named Odell Bigham pulled his truck off the county road at the edge of the Braddock property and sat with the engine idling. He had been calling farm auctions across eastern Kentucky for 26 years by then, long enough to have seen most things that happen when desperate men bid on broken equipment. He had not come to talk to anyone. He had not called ahead. He had simply found himself driving past on a Tuesday afternoon and turned the wheel without quite deciding to. From the road, he could see the field. And in the field, moving slow and steady through the standing wheat, was a machine he recognized. He sat there for 15 minutes. The engine idled. He did not get out. What Odell was looking at was a 1964 John Deere 45 combine harvester that he had sold 7 years earlier for $4,200 to the only man in a field of 31 people who had raised his hand. Every dealer, every land broker, every cooperative representative who had been there that morning had walked away from it. The machine had been parked behind a storage barn since 1976. Raccoons had nested in the grain tank. The rear tires had sunk into the earth. Someone had leaned a plywood sign against the front wheel with the word SIS painted in orange spray paint. Odell had called, going once, and the lot had gone quiet as a church. Now the machine was cutting wheat on a clear afternoon in Harlan County, Kentucky, moving through the field as though it had never stopped. Odell put the truck in gear and drove away without knocking on the door. He was not ready to explain what he had come to understand sitting at the end of that lane. He was not sure he could explain it even to himself. But the story of how that machine came to be running in that field on that afternoon begins 7 years earlier, and it begins not with Clem Braddock and not with the machine, but with a woman standing in a garden who already knew what the answer was going to cost. Bertie Braddock, who had been Bertie to everyone who knew her since before she could remember, was pulling weeds from between the rows of her kitchen garden when she heard Odell's truck idle at the road. She straightened up and looked. She recognized the truck, though she did not know Odell well. She knew who he was, the way people in small counties know each other by association, by transaction, by the stories that move through a community, the way water moves through limestone, slowly and without announcement. She watched him sit there. She did not walk out to greet him. She watched the truck idle for a long time, and she watched it pull away, and then she went back to her weeding. Later, she would say that she knew what he had come to see. She knew because she had been the one, 7 years before, who had sat up past midnight with a composition notebook and written down everything they stood to lose. The farm, the land, the 94 acres that Clem's grandfather had cleared from hardwood timber at the beginning of the century. The future she had been building in her mind for Wendell, who was 16 years old and had his whole life still in front of him. She had written the list, and then she had sat with it for a long time in the kitchen of the farmhouse where she had lived for 19 years, and then she had folded the notebook, closed, and gone to bed. She had not told Clem about the list. She never did. That is where the story really begins. The auction was held on the 14th of March, 1987, on a gravel lot in Harlan County, on the property of a farm estate that was being liquidated. It was a cold morning with a thin skin, the kind of quiet that settles over eastern Kentucky when the wind drops out of the hills. There were 31 people standing in the lot by 9 o'clock. Equipment dealers from Lexington who had made the 2-hour drive through the hills because the inventory list had looked promising from a distance. Roscoe Gunnell, a land broker from Tennessee, who drove up specifically for the sale and was already running the numbers in his head about what the property might be worth if the right buyer came along. Willard Landrum, who represented a regional agricultural cooperative that had been quietly acquiring distressed farm assets across the county for most of the decade, and who had paid $200 to have a professional equipment inspector look at everything on the lot the week before. The reporter from the county paper had come hoping for a story about the end of something. She brought a notepad and a pen and stood near the coffee table by the barn doors. And there was Clem Braddock, who had driven out alone that morning, parked his truck at the edge of the lot, and gone directly to the far fence where the machine sat. The 1964 John Deere 45 was enormous even in its ruin. It had been a serious piece of equipment in its time, built in East Moline, Illinois, during a year when American agriculture was pushing hard towards scale and efficiency. 70 horsepower, a 10-foot cutting platform, a grain tank that held 56 bushels before it needed to unload. When it had come off the assembly line, it had represented the cutting edge of what a farm family could own. Now it sat on a patch of gravel near the far fence with one rear tire completely flat, the engine cowling, missing a section of the auger housing repaired at some unknown point, with a sheet of galvanized tin and a row of bolts that were already rusting through. The grain tank had rust streaking down its sides in long brown lines. The cutting platform drooped at one end. The whole machine had the look of something that had been abandoned in the middle of a sentence. Clem Braddock spent 2 hours with it. He had brought a flashlight. He had lain down on the cold gravel and worked himself under the machine with the light held in one hand, moving it slowly along the undercarriage. The way a doctor moves a stethoscope, not looking for what was visible, but listening through his eyes for what the metal was telling him. He found the serial number plate under a 1/4 inch of caked oil and field dust and wrote the number in the small notebook he kept in the breast pocket of his coat. Then he worked his way out, stood up, and moved to the engine block. He traced the intake lines with his fingertips. He pressed his palm flat against the cylinder head and held it there for a long moment, feeling not for warmth because the engine had been cold for 11 years, but for the subtle texture of cast iron that is held. There are cracks in engine blocks that you can find with your hand before you can find them with your eyes if you know what you are feeling for. Clem Braddock knew what he was feeling for because he had rebuilt 11 engines by hand over the course of his life, not repaired, but fully disassembled, measured, machined where necessary, and reassembled, and he had kept a written record of every one. He was looking at 3 things, and only 3 things, and this is the only place in this story where those 3 things will be named directly, because Clem understood them not as a checklist, but as a conversation with the machine. The frame and structural welds had held. 11 Kentucky winters had not cracked the places where failure would be catastrophic rather than merely expensive. The engine block showed no evidence of a seized piston or a cracked casting, and the cylinder walls, as best he could assess through the intake ports, had not corroded past the point of usefulness. And the separator drive failure that had ended the machine's working life in the autumn of 1976 was, in Clem's assessment, a repairable condition. He could not be certain. He could not know for certain until the machine was in pieces in his barn, but he was certain enough. He stood up, brushed the gravel from his coat, and went to get coffee. It was while he was standing at the coffee table that Willard Landrum crossed the lot toward him. Willard was a deliberate man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that stays neutral, regardless of what he is thinking. He had been watching Clem under the machine. He had watched the whole thing, and now he walked over with his hands in his coat pockets. "Braddock," Willard said. He did not lower his voice. "I had a professional look at this machine last week. I've got his report in my truck if you want to read it. Save us both some time." Clem looked at him. "What did you pay for the report?" Willard paused just slightly. $200. "Did the man lie down in the gravel?" Willard said nothing. "I appreciate it," Clem said. He turned back to his coffee. Willard stood there for another moment and then walked back across the lot. Clem did not watch him go. He was looking at the machine from a new angle now, from a distance, the way you look at something after you have already looked at it up close. He was checking his own assessment. He was asking himself whether what he had seen on his back in the gravel matched what he was seeing now on his feet in the morning light. He decided that it did. Standing 20 feet away with a cup of coffee, not quite out of earshot, was Corbett Dunbar. Corbett was 43 years old and had been the most respected mechanical mind in the county for the better part of a decade. He had learned his trade at a diesel shop in Lexington, come back home when his father's health failed, and recently opened his own equipment repair shop on the south end of town. He was not a bad man. He was in many ways an exceptionally good one. He was honest about his prices, careful about his work, and well-liked by the farmers who brought their machines to him. He looked at the 1964 John Deere 45 with the eyes of a man who calculated repair costs in billable hours, and what he saw was a number that did not add up. He said it to the man standing next to him, not quietly. "That thing will cost more to fix than it's worth, and it'll never run right anyway." Poor Braddock. His wife's not going to be happy. Clem heard it. He did not turn around. Odell Bigham opened the bidding at 9:40 in the morning. He was a careful auctioneer, deliberate in the way of men who have learned that silence at the wrong moment can cost everyone in the lot. But he was not prepared for what happened when he asked for opening bids on the 1964 John Deere 45. Nothing happened. 30 people stood in that gravel lot, and nobody moved. Roscoe Gunnell from Tennessee had already looked at the machine for roughly 40 seconds and walked back toward the coffee table. The dealers from Lexington had not gotten out of their truck. Willard Landrum stood with his hands in his coat pockets and his face showing nothing. The reporter from the county paper had her pen ready. Odell waited. He had been doing this long enough to know the difference between a crowd deciding and a crowd that has already decided. This crowd had already decided. "Do I have an opening bid?" he said. Clem Braddock set down his coffee cup. $4,200. Odell looked at him. Then he looked at the 30 people who had not bid. Then he looked back at Clem. The lot was so quiet you could hear the wind moving in the fence wire at the far edge of the property. "Going once," Odell said. Nobody moved. "Going twice." The reporter's pen was on the paper, but she was not writing. She was watching. Odell Bigham brought the gavel down. It was in the moment after the gavel fell, while Odell was still processing what had just happened, that Willard Landrum walked over to Clem for the second time that morning. This time his voice was lower. "You know that machine hasn't run since '76, Willard said. Clem was folding his receipt. He put it in the same breast pocket as the notebook with the serial number. "I know," he said. "That's why nobody else wanted it." Willard looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man trying to locate the flaw in an argument that should have an obvious flaw. Then he turned and walked back toward his truck. Roscoe Gunnell, who had overheard, watched Clem with something close to curiosity before getting into his own vehicle. Corbett Dunbar was quiet now, standing with his arms crossed, looking at the machine. Clem did not notice any of them. He was already thinking about the barn. To understand what Clem Braddock did at that auction and why he did it, you have to go back further than 1987. You have to go back to a farmhouse kitchen in Harlan County in the early 1950s, to a boy of 12 sitting next to his father on a wooden stool while the winter settled hard over the hills outside. Lovick Braddock was the kind of man the 20th century was slowly making obsolete without quite knowing it. He had grown up in a world where replacement was not an option and had therefore developed a relationship with broken machinery that was closer to conversation than repair. He did not look at a failed engine and see a problem to be solved. He looked at it and asked what it was trying to tell him. "The machine doesn't lie to you," Lovick said one night, not looking up from the pump motor he was working on by lantern light, speaking to Clem the way men like Lovick spoke to their sons as though the boy were already the person he was still becoming. "It only tells you what it knows. Your job is to ask the right question." Clem did not understand what that meant when he was 12. He would spend the next 35 years understanding it. Lovick Braddock repaired things not because the financial calculation recommended it, but because the alternative did not exist. The farm ran on machines that had been cobbled together from 3 different salvage yards modified by hand, kept alive by a form of ingenuity that was not born from creativity, but from necessity, which is a harder and more reliable teacher. Clem grew up inside that culture the way most children grow up inside a language. It was not something he learned. It was something he absorbed through his hands and his ears and the long hours in the cold workshop watching his father ask machines what was wrong with them. He left the farm at 20 for 2 years of Army service. He was stationed in Germany and ended up working in a motor pool, and it was there that a staff sergeant named Drew Faulkner, who had spent time in Korea working aircraft maintenance and had since developed a precise eye for mechanical talent, watched Clem diagnose a fault in a 2.5-ton truck's fuel system that 3 other mechanics had missed. "Where did you learn to do that?" Faulkner asked. Clem thought about it. "My father's barn, Harlan County, Kentucky." Faulkner nodded the way men nod when an answer explains more than the words in it. He did not say anything else. But he told Clem twice more before the posting ended that he had the most reliable mechanical instinct Faulkner had seen in a man without formal training, that he could hear something wrong in a system before the instruments confirmed it, that he had the rarest quality in any kind of diagnostic work, which was the willingness to keep asking after the obvious answer had already presented itself. Clem went home anyway. In 1968, he married Bertie Calhoun from the next county, a coal miner's daughter who had grown up understanding poverty, not as a temporary condition, but as a geography with its own history and its own particular way of looking at you from the faces of people who had more. She was 24 years old when she married Clem. She was precise, observant, and not easily frightened, which did not mean she was not afraid of things, but that she had learned to work alongside her fear rather than waiting for it to leave. They moved into the farmhouse on the 94 acres that Clem's grandfather had cleared from hardwood timber at the beginning of the century, and they began the long work of farming land that had never been easy land and had never pretended to be. By 1987, Bertie had been keeping the farm's financial records for 19 years, with the same quiet precision that Clem kept his mechanical notebooks. Every receipt, every expenditure, every season's income recorded in her careful hand. She had not been trained in accounting. She had been trained by worry, and worry sustained long enough becomes expertise. She knew exactly what they had when Clem came home on the afternoon of March 14th with the receipt in his pocket. She did not find out until that evening. Clem sat down at the kitchen table and told her what he had done the way he told her most things, directly without cushioning. He had bought the machine. He had paid $4,200. He believed it could be restored. He could not tell her yet how much the restoration would cost, because he did not know precisely, but there would be additional costs, and he wanted her to know that before she looked at the account. Bertie opened the composition notebook where she kept the finances and looked at the numbers for a while without speaking. Then she looked up. "Clem," she said, "I need you to answer me honestly. How much more are we looking at? $1,000, 10,000? I don't know exactly." She looked at him steadily. "You don't know." "Not yet, not until I get into it." It was the first time in 19 years of marriage that she had heard him say those words about something that mattered this much, and the particular quality of her fear in that moment was not the fear of losing money, though the money was real and the fear of losing it was real. It was the fear of not being able to read the man she had built her life beside. She had always been able to read him. He was not given to impulse or to wishful thinking. He was precise in everything he did, and he did not commit to things he was not certain of. And he was telling her he was not certain. "Can you be wrong about this?" she asked. He looked at her across the table. Yes, he said, I can be wrong. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the March fields were brown and still waiting. All right, Bertie said. She did not say it warmly. She said it the way you say something when you have decided that saying it is the only honest option. But I need you to tell me every time there's more, not when it's done. Every time. I will, Clem said. She stood up and began clearing the table. The conversation was over. But that night after Clem was asleep, she sat alone in the kitchen with the composition notebook open in front of her. She turned to a fresh page and wrote in her careful hand a list of everything they stood to lose if she was wrong to trust him: the farm, the house, the land, the future she had been building in her mind for Wendell. She sat with the list for a long time. Then she folded the notebook closed. She never showed Clem that page. The following day, a Saturday, Weldon Whitlow came across from his 80 acres next door. Weldon was 51 and had been farming the land next to the Braddock property since his father retired. He was not a demonstrative man, but he was steady, and in a county where steady men were harder to find each year, that counted for a great deal. He had heard about the auction, the way news traveled in Harlan County, which was quickly and with reasonable accuracy. He found Clem in the barn doing the first inventory of what the season's equipment would need. Weldon stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. I heard what you paid for that machine, Weldon said. Word travels, Clem said, not looking up from the parts he was sorting. Weldon was quiet for a moment. If you get it running, I want to be your first custom cutting job this summer. I'll sign something if you need. Clem looked up then. He studied Weldon's face. You don't think I can get it running? Weldon did not flinch from that. No, he said honestly, I don't. But I know you, and if anybody in this county can do it, you're the one. Clem held Weldon's gaze for a moment. There was something in the offer that he had not expected and could not quite name, which was that Weldon was not betting on the machine. Weldon was betting on him. That was a different kind of currency entirely. I'll let you know when it's ready, Clem said. He would. But it would take much longer than either of them could have imagined, standing in that barn on a March Saturday with the season still cold around them. The machine came to the farm on a borrowed flatbed truck later that week. Clem and Wendell, who was 16 and had his father's watchful quiet, cleared out the equipment bay of the main barn to receive it. When the machine was unloaded and positioned under the fluorescent lights of the bay, Wendell stood and looked at it for a long time. 11 years of Kentucky weather had not been kind to it. Up close in the light of the barn, the rust was deeper than it had appeared in the open lot. The smell of old oil and something organic and long abandoned came off it in waves. What did you buy this for? Wendell asked. Clem stood beside him and looked at the machine the same way he had looked at it in the gravel lot, slowly, systematically, without hurry. But there was a difference now that he could feel without naming it. In the lot he had been evaluating, here in his own barn, having signed his name and paid his money, he was committed. Those two states of mind were not the same thing, and they did not produce the same experience. For the first time since the auction, Clem Braddock felt the full weight of what he had done. You'll see, he told Wendell. He said it with the certainty he had carried out of that gravel lot. But standing in the barn with the machine looming above them both, he was aware for one honest moment that he was not as certain as he sounded. He went back to work anyway. That was the only answer he had ever known for the gap between what you were sure of and what you were not. The first real problem declared itself on a Tuesday morning in late March, 8 days after the machine arrived in the barn, and it was worse than anything Clem had found lying in the gravel at the auction lot. He had known going in that the separator drive system was the wound that had killed the machine in 1976. What he had not known, because you cannot know it from the outside looking in with a flashlight, was the full pattern of what that wound had done on its way out. When the primary drive shaft had finally failed after years of accumulated metal fatigue, it had not simply stopped. It had come apart under load, and the force of that failure had traveled backward through the housing in a wind that left the casing itself compromised, cracked along stress lines that followed the grain of the casting in a pattern Clem had not seen before. He sat on the cold concrete floor of the barn for a long time after he found it, the flashlight in his hand not moving. The separator drive housing for a 1964 John Deere 45 was not a part you ordered from a catalog. The machine had been out of production for more than a decade. The supply chain that once supported it had thinned to almost nothing, and what little remained was scattered across the country in salvage yards and equipment graveyards that did not advertise and did not have telephone listings in any directory Clem owned. He would have to write letters. That evening at the kitchen table after Wendell had gone to bed, Clem told Bertie what he had found. He told her plainly without softening the detail because that had been the agreement. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she opened the composition notebook and wrote down the new information in the column she had started for restoration costs. "How do you find the part?" she asked. "Letters," Clem said. "Salvage yards, equipment dealers, cooperatives, anyone who might have pulled one off a dead machine." "How many letters?" "As many as it takes." She looked at the column of numbers and then back at him. "All right," she said, "we start tomorrow." What she did not tell him was that she would be the one to carry those letters to the post office because the post office was in town and she went to town twice a week for feed and supplies, and it was simply more efficient. She did not frame it as support. She framed it as logistics. But over the following 3 weeks, she stood at the post office counter and handed envelopes across to the woman at the window. Envelopes addressed to salvage operations in Tennessee and Ohio and Indiana, to equipment dealers in 3 states, to cooperatives she had found the names of through the county extension office. She did not read the letters. She did not need to. She counted them instead the way she counted everything that mattered, precisely and without sentiment. 23 letters. 23 chances that the part existed somewhere and that someone would write back. Now on a Thursday morning in April, she was at the counter with 2 more envelopes in hand when Arlene Landrum came in behind her. Arlene was Willard's wife, a straight-spoken woman in her mid-40s who taught Sunday school and kept her opinions close to the surface where they were easy to find. She was not a cruel person. She was the kind of person who believed that honesty delivered with good intentions was always the right approach regardless of whether the recipient had asked for it. "Bertie," she said, falling into line, "I've been meaning to ask, how are you holding up with all this?" Bertie handed her envelopes across the counter before she answered. "Fine, Arlene, thank you. Willard told me about the machine." Arlene lowered her voice slightly, though there was no one else in the post office. "His man looked at it, before the auction. He said it was a money pit. Willard felt bad actually watching Clem bid on it." Bertie accepted her receipt from the window and turned to face Arlene. "Willard's man didn't lie in the gravel," she said, and she said it without edge, as a simple statement of fact. Then she smiled, brief and genuine, and said she would see Arlene at church on Sunday, and walked out. In the truck on the way home, she sat with her hands on the wheel and did not turn the key for a moment. Arlene had not said anything that Bertie had not already said to herself alone in the kitchen, with the composition notebook open in front of her. That was the part that made it land differently than an attack would have. Arlene was not wrong. The machine might be a money pit. Clem might be wrong. Bertie had lived with that possibility every day since the auction, and she had chosen each morning to continue living alongside it rather than letting it make the decision for her. She turned the key and drove home. 2 replies came back from the 23 letters. The first was an apology from a salvage operation in southern Ohio. They had pulled two 45s over the past decade, both stripped beyond the point of useful parts, and they had nothing. The second was a quote. A small equipment dealer in central Tennessee had a separator drive housing pulled from a 45 that had been partially dismantled for parts in the early 1980s. The housing had been sitting on a shelf in a back storeroom unmoved for 6 years. The dealer was not certain of its condition, but believed it to be serviceable. His price was $1,140. Clem read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then he handed it to Bertie without comment. She read it. She set it down. She opened the notebook. The column now read machine purchase $4,200. Separator housing $1,140. She did not say anything for a moment. Order it, she said. He did. It was around this same time before the housing arrived that Willard Landrum came to call. He arrived on a January afternoon unannounced, driving the late-model truck that announced his relative prosperity to anyone paying attention. He knocked at the farmhouse door, and Bertie answered, and she brought him into the kitchen and poured him coffee the way you poured anyone coffee in Harlan County, regardless of how you felt about their reason for coming. Willard sat at the kitchen table with his hat on the table beside him, and he was courteous and careful in the way of a man who has thought about what he wants to say before he says it. He asked after Wendell. He talked about the season, about how the farm credit situation was affecting the whole county. He was good at this part, the preamble, the establishment of good faith before the actual purpose of a visit. Then he placed a single folded piece of paper on the table. I want you to know this isn't pressure, Willard said. I have a lot of respect for what you're trying to do out here, Clem. The whole county does. But the climate right now, the interest rates, the commodity prices, it's hard for everybody. And I've been authorized to make an offer that I think is fair. Better than fair, actually. 15% above current assessed value. Clem looked at the paper on the table. He did not pick it up. Willard continued, you'd be able to settle everything and still have capital left to start somewhere smaller, if that's what made sense. I'm not saying it's the right answer. I'm saying it's an answer. The kitchen was quiet. Bertie was standing at the counter, and she did not turn around during the speech. She was looking out the window at the bare January fields, the same fields that Clem's grandfather had cleared and planted, and that Clem's father had worked, and that Clem himself had farmed for 19 years. I appreciate you coming, Willard, Clem said. Think about it, Willard said. He stood up, put his hat on, and shook Clem's hand at the door. He left the piece of paper on the table. After the truck pulled out of the yard, Clem and Bertie stood in the kitchen looking at the paper without speaking. Neither of them moved toward it. Finally, Clem picked it up, walked to the small writing desk in the corner, and placed it in the top drawer. Not in the trash, not on the table, in the drawer. Bertie watched him do this. She understood exactly what it meant. He was not throwing it away because he wanted to remember that it existed. He wanted to be able to look at it when the doubt was loudest and know that there was a way out if he needed one, and he was choosing each day not to take it. She said nothing. She turned back to the stove. The paper stayed in the drawer. Corbett Dunbar came by the barn on the first Saturday of May, 3 weeks after the housing had been ordered, and 2 days before it was due to arrive. He came alone in the late morning, and Clem heard his truck in the yard and went to the barn door to meet him. Corbett was a man who kept his intentions visible, which was a quality Clem respected even when the intentions themselves were inconvenient. I heard you found problems, Corbett said. He was looking past Clem into the barn at the machine disassembled now, across a wide area of the floor, each component laid out in the order it had been removed. Some, Clem said. Corbett walked into the barn without being invited because that was how things worked between men who had known each other since grade school. He walked slowly along the edge of the disassembly, looking at each component the way he looked at everything in his professional life, with a calm and unsentimental eye. He stopped at the damaged housing and looked at it for a long time without touching it. "You found a replacement?" he asked. "Coming in from Tennessee." Corbett nodded. He straightened up and put his hands in his pockets. "Braddock," he said, "I'll give you $800 for the paints on this floor that are still usable. That's a fair price. I can move them, and you walk away without digging the hole any deeper." Clem looked at him. "That's not a low offer," Corbett said. "I'm not trying to take advantage. You know me better than that." "I know you're not," Clem said. "Then why not?" Clem looked at the components on the floor spread across the concrete in the order he had removed them over the past several weeks. He had touched every single piece. He knew what each one was and what condition it was in and what it would cost to bring it back. "Because if I sell now, I won't know whether I was wrong or whether I just didn't have enough patience. And I need to know which one it is." Corbett was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that meant he had heard something he had not expected. "That's a hard way to find out," he said. "Yes," Clem agreed. Corbett looked at the machine one more time. "When you change your mind, I'm still here." He walked back out to his truck. He said it without contempt, which was what made it a real warning rather than an insult. He believed Clem was going to change his mind. He was not trying to hurt him. He was trying to give him a door to walk through before the alternative got worse. Clem went back to work. The separator housing arrived from Tennessee on a Thursday, packed in a wooden crate that had been reinforced with metal strapping. Clem opened it in the barn with Wendell beside him. The housing was dusty and had surface oxidation along one edge, but when Clem cleaned it and examined it carefully, turning it in his hands and running his fingers along the critical mating surfaces, he found no cracking and no warping beyond acceptable tolerance. He set it on the workbench and stood back and looked at it for a long time. "Is it good?" Wendell asked. "Good enough," Clem said, which in his vocabulary was the same thing. The cylinder work was the next problem. He had the engine block transported to a machine shop in town, and the machinist there, a man named Grover, who had been boring and honing agricultural engines for 30 years, called Clem on a Friday afternoon with news that was not surprising, but was still hard to hear. Two of the cylinders had worn beyond the range where rings alone would restore proper compression. They needed sleeve steel liners pressed into the bores to bring them back to usable dimension. Grover's estimate was $680 for the sleeve work and the associated machine time. That evening, Clem and Bertie sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open between them. The column now read $4,200 plus $1,140 plus $680 plus the cost of bearings throughout the machine, new knife sections and reel drive overhaul for the cutting platform, hydraulic cylinder rebuilds, and a complete wiring harness replacement because the original had been partially consumed by the animals that had sheltered in the grain tank through 11 winters. The total estimate, assembled carefully and conservatively, came to something approaching $9,300. "We have $2,800 in the reserve account," Bertie said. She did not say it as an accusation. She said it because it was true and they both needed to hear it said plainly. Clem looked at the numbers. He had been looking at numbers like these all his life on land that had never given easy returns, and he had learned that numbers told you where you were, but not necessarily where you were going. "There's the cattle sale in July," he said. "That covers operating costs through fall planting." "I know." Bertie set the pen down. She did not close the notebook. She looked at her husband across the table in the light of the kitchen lamp, a man she had lived beside for 19 years, a man she had never once known to be reckless or careless or motivated by pride. She was trying to locate in his face the thing that was driving this, the thing that had made him lie in the gravel at the auction lot and write down a serial number and bid $4,200 when every experienced person on that lot had already made their decision. Clem, she said, if this were someone else's money, if Willard Landrum came to you and said he wanted to put $10,000 into restoring that machine, would you tell him to do it? Clem looked at her. He did not answer immediately because she deserved a real answer. No, he said. Why not, Em? Because I'm not certain enough to spend someone else's money. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the spring night was cold and still. But you're certain enough to spend ours, Bertie said. I'm certain enough for ours, Clem said. There was a distinction in that, and they both heard it. It was not a comfortable distinction. It was an honest one. He was not certain enough to recommend this to anyone else. He was certain enough only for himself for the particular knowledge that lived in his hands and his ears, and the 35 years he had spent learning to ask machinery the right questions. Bertie looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the pen and wrote the new totals in the notebook in her careful hand. All right, she said, but we do the cattle sale early if we need to, and you tell me before we hit the line, not after. I will. She stood up and went to the stove. She came back with 2 cups of coffee and sat back down, and they sat together in the kitchen for a while without talking, which was one of the ways they had always done their most important communicating. Christmas came and went. Wendell had asked for one thing, a better set of combination wrenches for work in the barn, and Clem had bought them without comment. On Christmas morning, when Wendell unwrapped them, Clem watched his son's face and understood for the first time that the boy was not simply helping with the project. He was learning something, and he had decided to learn it deliberately, which was a different thing entirely. February arrived with the particular cold that settles into eastern Kentucky limestone and does not let go. Clem was in the barn every day and most evenings. The machine was coming back together slowly, each system rebuilt and reinstalled according to the sequence he had planned from the beginning, working outward from the center. He had replaced every bearing in the straw walkers, the shoe assembly, and the feeder house. He had rebuilt the hydraulic cylinders at a shop in town. The new wiring harness was in. The cutting platform had new knife sections and a completely overhauled reel drive. On a Tuesday morning in the second week of February, he stood in the barn in the gray winter light and looked at the machine and could not make the doubt go away. It had been coming for weeks, this particular kind of uncertainty, not dramatic and not sudden, but slow and persistent, the way groundwater moves through stone. He had been as careful as he knew how to be. He had done everything right, and yet there was no guarantee. Machines that had been dormant for 11 years could hold failures too deep to find until you turned the key, failures that would only reveal themselves under the pressure of actual operation. And if one of those failures was waiting for him, if there was a crack somewhere in the casting that had not shown itself, a bearing journal too far gone to seat properly, then the 10 months of work and the $9,300 of real money would be finished. He stood there for a long time in the coal barn, not moving. Then he heard the door. Bertie had come out at 9 in the evening because Clem had not come in for supper, and she had waited as long as she could. She stood in the doorway of the barn for a moment, looking at her husband standing still in front of the machine, and she understood immediately what kind of standing still it was. She had been married to him long enough to know the difference between a man thinking and a man doubting, and those two things inhabited a person's body differently. She did not ask what was wrong. She pulled the second wooden stool from against the wall and set it beside his and sat down. They sat without speaking for a long time. The barn was cold and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and outside the February wind moved through the gaps in the siding with a low, constant sound. I might have been wrong, Clem said finally. He said it to the machine, not to her. About which part? She asked. I don't know. That's the problem. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the same machine he was looking at. What do you see when you look at it now? He thought about that. I see what I've done and what's left to do. Then you know what comes next. He looked at her then sideways, and she was looking at the machine with the same steady attention she brought to everything. She was not offering comfort. She was offering the only thing that was actually useful, which was clarity about what the next step was. "Come in and eat," she said. "It'll be here in the morning." She stood up and walked back to the house. Clem sat alone in the barn for a few more minutes. Then he followed her in. Spring came slowly that year, the way it always came to the hills, apologetically giving back warmth in small increments, as though it did not quite trust that winter was over. Clem completed the reassembly through March and into April, and by the second week of April, he was ready for what he had been building toward for more than a year. He primed the fuel system. He checked the compression readings from the re-sleeved cylinders. He verified the timing on the injection sequence. He climbed into the operator's seat on a Wednesday morning in mid-April, with Wendell standing 10 feet back and Bertie visible at the barn door, which she had positioned herself at without Clem noticing until he was already in the seat. He turned the key. The engine turned over. It turned over for 3 full seconds with the particular grinding urgency of a starter motor, pushing against a cold engine, and then it slowed, and then it stopped. No fire, no combustion. The engine had turned and had not caught. Clem sat in the seat and did not move for a moment. Then he climbed down and began the diagnostic process with the same methodical patience he brought to every problem, working through the fuel delivery, the injection timing, the compression, the glow plug circuit. It took him most of the morning. By noon, he had located the fault. The injection pump, which he had cleaned and pressure tested and judged serviceable, had a delivery valve that had failed under the actual load of a start attempt when it had not failed under bench testing. The valve was microscopic in its fault and enormous in its consequence. Without it seating properly, the fuel could not reach 2 of the 6 cylinders under starting conditions. The pump would need to be rebuilt or replaced. He called a specialist in Louisville that afternoon, a man who still worked on older agricultural diesel injection systems from a small shop near the river. The rebuilt pump would cost $340 and would take 10 days to arrive. Clem hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a moment without moving. Bertie was at the table with the notebook. She had heard the conversation. $340, she said. Not a question. She was writing it down. Yes. She wrote the number and closed the notebook. Then she looked up at him. He was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, and he had the look of a man who had just discovered that the finish line had moved again. Clem, she said. He looked at her. Is there anything structurally wrong with that machine? Anything you found in the last 14 months that tells you it cannot run? He thought about it honestly. No. Then this is a pump. Yes. Order it. That night after Bertie had gone to bed, Clem went out to the barn alone. He did not turn on the overhead lights. He stood in the dark with the machine, a large silent shape in front of him, and he put his hand flat against the cold metal of the engine block. Not assessing, not reading, just the weight of a hand on something he had committed to, the way his father had always touched the things that mattered most to him before making the final call. He stood in the dark for a long time. The decision had already been made. His hand on the cold engine was not looking for confirmation, it was saying something. Then he went inside and called the specialist in Louisville to confirm the order. The rebuilt pump arrived on a Thursday in the 3rd week of May in a brown cardboard box with the Louisville postmark, and Clem brought it into the barn and set it on the workbench and stood looking at it for a moment before he opened the box. Wendell was at school. Bertie was in the house. Clem opened the box alone, unwrapped the pump from its protective packing, and examined it under the work light. It was clean and precise and correctly rebuilt, and it was the last piece. He installed it that afternoon. When Wendell came home from school, Clem was still in the barn, finishing the final connections, and Wendell came in without being told to, and stood at Clem's shoulder and watched the last of it go into place. Clem handed him the final bolt without explaining why, and Wendell understood without being told that he was meant to drive it home himself. He picked up the socket wrench and seated the bolt and tightened it with the careful, even pressure of someone who had been paying attention. Clem checked it, solid. That night at the kitchen table, Bertie asked what time he planned to try in the morning. Clem told her 6 o'clock. She nodded and said she would have coffee ready. He went to bed at 10 and lay in the dark for a long time before sleep came. He had spent 14 months and every dollar of margin they had on a machine that still had not run. Tomorrow it would either run or it would not. If it did not, he would find the reason and address it the way he had found every other reason and addressed it. But there was a limit to how many more reasons there could be. He had gone through the machine systematically, and he was out of unknowns. Whatever happened tomorrow morning would tell him whether his assessment in the gravel lot had been right, not just careful, not just thorough, but right. He slept eventually. The morning of the 18th of May came in cool and clear. The kind of spring morning in eastern Kentucky that arrives without apology after a long winter. New light and the smell of wet ground warming in the sun. Clem was in the barn before 6. He went through a final check of all systems, not because he expected to find something wrong, but because that was the only way he knew how to work completely and without shortcuts. At 6:15, he climbed into the operator's seat. Wendell was standing to his left. Bertie was at the barn door, and Clem had not known she was there until he was already in the seat, and when he looked over and saw her standing in the frame of the door, with her hands at her sides, he understood that she had risen in the dark and walked out here in the early morning, cold because there was no version of this moment that she was willing to miss. Weldon Whitlow was visible at the fence line at the edge of the yard holding a coffee cup looking toward the barn. Clem had not told Weldon he was trying this morning. Weldon had come on his own. Clem checked the throttle position. He checked the glow plug indicator. He put his hand on the key. He turned it. The starter motor engaged with the immediate urgency of a well-charged system, and the engine turned over once, twice, and on the third revolution, there was a change in the sound, a deepening, and then the first combustion, uneven at first 1 cylinder, and then 2, and then all 6 catching in sequence, and the engine came up from silence into a rough idle that smoothed as the fuel system pressurized, and the temperature began to climb, and the sound that filled the barn was not dramatic, but was instead exactly what it was supposed to be, the sound of a machine that had been rebuilt correctly running the way it had been designed to run. Clem sat in the seat and listened. He did not stand up. He did not shout. He kept both hands on the controls and listened to every frequency the running engine was producing, reading what the machine was telling him, through the seat, through the steering column, through the air, in the barn. He listened for 3 full minutes while the engine warmed to operating temperature, and everything he heard told him the same thing. It was right, all of it. The rebuild had held. When he climbed down, Wendell was there. "How is it?" Wendell asked. Clem looked at his son, then he nodded once slowly with the particular certainty of a man who has just confirmed something he needed to be sure of. "It's good," he said. "It's all right." He looked over at the barn door. Bertie was still standing there. He could see from across the barn that her right hand was gripping the door frame. Just for a moment. Then she let go and turned and walked back to the house, and Clem watched her go. And he understood that the grip on the doorframe had been the only acknowledgement she was going to allow herself, which was exactly as much as she needed. Weldon Whitlow called over from the fence line, not loudly. "Well," Clem looked across the yard at his neighbor. "Come over tonight," he said. "I'll tell you about the first cutting." Clem Braddock took the 1964 John Deere 45 into the field for the first time on a Thursday morning at the end of May, and he did it alone. Wendell had asked the night before if he could come. Clem had said no, and he had said it without explanation, which was the way he said things that required no explanation between a father and a son who had spent the past 14 months working side by side in a coal barn. Wendell had nodded and gone to bed, and he understood, because he was his father's son, that if the machine failed on its first real pass through standing grain, Clem did not want to witness to that failure. Not because of pride, because some accounting needed to happen privately before it could be shared. The field Clem chose was the lower 40, a section of his own land that ran flat along the creek bottom and had historically produced the most consistent wheat on the property. He chose it deliberately, not because he expected problems, but because he was still Clem Braddock, which meant he did not test rebuilt systems under difficult conditions when easier conditions were available. He lowered the cutting platform at the edge of the standing wheat. He engaged the separator. He pushed the machine forward into the first pass. The wheat went in. It moved through the feeder house and into the threshing cylinder and across the cleaning shoe and into the grain tank in the continuous, uninterrupted flow. That is the only measure that matters for a combine harvester. The only proof that all the separate systems are working together as a single mechanism. For 3 passes, Clem said nothing and did nothing except operate the machine and listen. He was reading through the vibration in the steering column and the sound in the air around him, whether the rebuild had produced a machine that would hold or a machine that was compensating somewhere in a way that would eventually become a failure. Everything he read told him the same thing. After the 3rd pass, he stopped the machine and climbed down and walked around it twice slowly. He looked at the separator drive housing, and it was running without the faintest trace of vibration or misalignment. He looked at the cutting platform and the reel drive in the feeder house chain. Everything was where it was supposed to be, doing what it was supposed to do. He sat down on the bank at the edge of the field. He had not planned to do this, but sitting down happened without his deciding, to the way certain things happen when the body knows something the mind is still catching up to. He took the notebook from his breast pocket. He turned to the first page where the serial number was written in the hand of a man who had been lying on cold gravel on a March morning more than a year ago. He looked at those numbers for a while. Then he turned to the next blank page and wrote the date in 3 words. The machine runs. He put the notebook back in his pocket and stood up and went back to work. He finished the lower field that day and the upper field the following morning, and on the 3rd day he began the first of the 3 custom cutting jobs he had lined up in advance, because he had arranged these contracts in the quiet confidence of a man who had not known with certainty that the machine would be ready, but had acted as though it would be, because the alternative was not to act, and that had never been an option he recognized. Weldon Whitlow's 80 acres were first. When Clem brought the machine down the road and turned into Weldon's lane, Weldon was standing at the gate. He opened it without ceremony, and Clem drove through and set up at the edge of Weldon's wheat field and went to work, and Weldon stood at the headland and watched. He watched for 2 full hours without moving, which was not like Weldon, who was a man who generally found stillness uncomfortable. At the end of the 2nd hour, when Clem came around on a return pass and stopped near where Weldon was standing, Weldon walked over. Clem climbed down. Weldon put his hand out. Clem shook it. $18 an acre, Clem said, and the 200. That was a contribution, Weldon said. He had been saying this since he handed Clem the envelope 8 months earlier. I don't take money I can't account for, Clem said. He had been saying this just as long. He reached into his shirt pocket, not the breast pocket where the notebook lived, and produced an envelope with Weldon's name written on it. Weldon took it and looked at it and put it in his own pocket without opening it. "You're a stubborn man, Clem Braddock," Weldon said. "I know it," Clem said. He climbed back up and finished Weldon's field that afternoon. Word moved through Harlan County the way it always moved through conversations at the feed store and the equipment dealer and after Sunday services, and by the end of the first summer, there were 2 additional farms that wanted custom cutting contracts for the following season. Clem honored every commitment he had made and took no new ones until the existing ones were complete. He ran the machine conservatively as he had planned because a first season was not the time to find out what a rebuilt machine could do at maximum capacity. In the second season, a hard lesson arrived without warning. A bearing in the cleaning shoe assembly failed during a cutting job on a neighbor's property, putting the machine down for 2 days in the middle of a dry spell when every farmer in the county needed to move fast. Clem called the neighbor that evening and told him directly. He absorbed the delay cost himself, sourced the bearing from Lexington by the following morning, completed the repair alone, and finished the job on the 3rd day. The neighbor, a man named Willis, who ran 110 acres on the far side of the ridge, shook Clem's hand when it was done and told him he would never hire anyone else as long as Clem was running. That was the season Clem understood that reliability was not just about the machine. It was about what you did when the machine failed you. By the 3rd season, he was cutting for 7 farms across the county on a custom basis. The rate had moved to $22 an acre, a number that attached itself not through negotiation, but through the word of farmers who had watched the work get done right every time. It was that same 3rd season, on a July afternoon at Weldon Whitlow's property, that Clem stood at the headland and watched Wendell make a full cutting pass alone for the first time. Wendell was 19 now, broad-shouldered, with the same attention in his face that Clem had always brought to anything that required it. He ran the machine the way he had been taught, not fast, but correct, and Clem stood with his arms at his sides and did not say anything. Weldon came and stood beside him. "He's good," Weldon said. "He's learning," Clem said. "Same thing for you," Weldon said. Clem said nothing, but Weldon was right. It was in the autumn of 1991 that Odell Bigham sat on a hay bale at a farm equipment show in Lexington and heard a number he was not prepared for. He had been talking to a man from the county extension office, a casual conversation that had drifted from one topic to another. The man from the extension office had mentioned the Braddock operation in passing as an example of custom cutting reliability in the region. And then he had mentioned the cumulative return figure, $31,400 net against an all-in investment of $15,400 in 4 seasons, from a machine that every experienced person at the auction had walked away from. Odell sat on the hay bale and did not say anything for a long time. The show continued around him. He did the arithmetic he had been in some part of his mind doing since the afternoon 3 years earlier, when he had pulled off the county road and watched the machine move through the wheat from a distance. He had not stopped then. He had not been ready to stop. But the number closed something that had been open in his thinking for 4 years. And when he finally started his truck in the parking lot of the equipment show and drove toward home, he did not take the direct route. He drove past the Braddock property. From the road, he could see lights in the barn. Someone was working. He slowed but did not stop. He drove on, and he thought about what Roy Callahan, an old auctioneer friend of his who had worked a different region for decades, had once told him, that the hardest thing in any auction room was not identifying what something was worth, but understanding that 2 people looking at the same object could be asking entirely different questions about it. Odell had nodded at the time without fully understanding. He understood now. The following spring, Willard Landrum heard the same number from a neighbor at a land management meeting in town. His reaction was different from Odell's in its form, but identical in its substance. He sat very still for a moment, and then he said something quiet about Clem Braddock always having been the most careful man in any room he stood in, and then the meeting moved on to other business. Willard thought about it for several months before he acted on it. What he eventually did was seek Clem out at the hardware store in town on an October afternoon, where their paths crossed with enough regularity that it did not require explanation or arrangement. They talked about the season for a few minutes, standing in the aisle with the plumbing fittings between them, and then Willard said what he had come to say. "I want to ask you something," Willard said. "At the auction, were you certain, or were you certain enough?" Clem looked at Willard directly. It was not a hostile question. Willard was asking it the way a man asks something when he genuinely wants to understand, when the gap between his expectation and the outcome has been large enough that he needs to locate where his thinking went wrong. "Certain about what I saw," Clem said. "Not certain about the rest." Willard nodded slowly. "That distinction," he said. "That's all there is," Clem said. Willard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I put that offer on your table because I thought you were in over your head. I want you to know I understand now that I was wrong about that." "The offer was fair," Clem said. "I understood why you made it." They shook hands and went back to their separate errands. That evening, Clem came home and went to the small writing desk in the corner of the kitchen and opened the top drawer. The folded piece of paper was still there where it had been since the January afternoon years earlier, when he had placed it in the drawer instead of the trash. He took it out and looked at it once briefly, and then he walked to the kitchen and held it out to Bertie, who was at the stove. She took it and looked at it and looked at him. "Why didn't you throw this away back then?" she asked. "Because I wanted to remember it was a choice," Clem said, "and that we chose something else." Bertie looked at the paper for a moment longer. Then she folded it in half and dropped it in the trash can under the sink. She turned back to the stove without ceremony. Clem stood in the kitchen for a moment watching her. He went back to his chair. The drawer was empty now. It was in this same season that Corbett Dunbar came back to the Braddock farm alone, and on a Saturday morning the same as before, and found Clem at the equipment bay doing postseason maintenance. Corbett stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the machine clean now and at rest. Then he looked at Clem. "I heard the season went well," Corbett said. "It did," Clem said. He did not stop working. Corbett had been carrying something for the better part of 3 years, and he had decided to put it down. "The injection pump," he said. "I would have caught the housing issue. I might have caught the cylinder wear. But I would have cleared that ejection pump the same way you did, and I would have been wrong about it the same way you were. I just wanted to say that." Clem looked up from what he was doing. "I just wanted to say that," Corbett said again, because he was the kind of man who said things twice when they cost him something. "I appreciate it," Clem said. Corbett nodded. He shifted to the practical ground where he was most comfortable. "You have more cutting work than you can handle alone. I know 3 farms looking for reliable custom work. I can send them to you." "Send them," Clem said. Corbett nodded once and got back in his truck. It was also that autumn at a church social that Arlene Landrum found herself standing near Bertie at the dessert table. Arlene had thought about the post office conversation more than once over the years, and she was not a woman who let things sit unaddressed forever. "I heard what Clem's done with that machine," Arlene said. "Word travels," Bertie said, which was what Clem always said when news got around, and Arlene caught the echo and almost smiled. "I owe you an honest conversation," Arlene said. "I came at you hard that morning at the post office, and I wasn't wrong about the facts, but I was wrong about the conclusion." Bertie looked at her. "You weren't wrong to be worried. I was worried too. But you kept going anyway." "I kept going alongside him," Bertie said. "That's different." Arlene was quiet for a moment, taking that distinction in. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it is." They stood together at the dessert table for a moment longer. 2 women who had been on opposite sides of the same uncertainty and had come out in different places, and the distance between those places was not as large as it had seemed at the time. The machine ran its 11th consecutive season in 1998. By then, it had cut grain on 9 farms across the county, had operated through drought seasons, and wet ones had been serviced at the end of every operating period with the same systematic care that Clem applied to everything he owned, and had not produced a single season in which it failed to complete its contracted work. The total net return over 11 seasons, when Bertie calculated it in the composition notebook that had tracked every dollar since the beginning, was a figure that had long since made the original question of whether the investment was sound feel like a question from a different life. The fault that ended the machine's working years on the Braddock property came in the 3rd week of August, in the middle of the custom cutting season. Clem was on a neighbor's property 20 minutes from home when he heard a change in the sound from the threshing cylinder housing a specific kind of irregular vibration that told him as clearly as any instrument could that the casting had developed a crack. He stopped the machine immediately and climbed down and looked, and the crack was there, a fine line running from a bolt hole along the grain of the metal. He stood beside the machine in the standing wheat for a while, not moving. He was asking the machine what it was telling him, the same question he had always asked, and the machine answered the same way it always had, honestly. The casting was at the end of its useful life. The repair would cost more relative to the machine's remaining value than the repair was worth. He knew this with the same certainty he had known everything else about this machine, because the certainty came from the same place it had always come from looking carefully at what was actually there. He called the neighbor from the field and arranged to finish the job with a rented machine the following week. He honored the contract. He always honored the contract. A few weeks later, through Weldon, he heard that a larger used machine was available from a farm estate in the next county. Clem drove over and looked at it for 2 hours, and what he found was what he had expected: a machine with years of productive life remaining at a price that reflected an estate's need for liquidity rather than the machine's actual value. He bought it. The 1964 John Deere 45 went to a young farmer named Truett Sisson, 32 years old, from Bell County, who had heard about the machine and driven to the Braddock farm on a Saturday morning to look at it. Truett was the kind of young farmer who was still building his operation from whatever he could afford, doing the math in a way that other people's math did not account for. Clem spent 2 hours with Truett walking through every system on the machine. He showed him the separator drive housing and explained its history. He showed him the re-sleeved cylinders and what to watch for as the sleeves accumulated more hours. He showed him the injection pump and the specific test that would catch valve behavior before it became a failed start. He wrote all of this down in a clear hand on 2 sheets of notebook paper and gave them to Truett, along with the maintenance log he had kept since 1987. Truett stood with the papers in his hand and looked at the machine and then at Clem. "Why are you giving me all this?" Clem looked at the machine. "Because someone should have given it to me," he said, "and because the machine's been honest with me for 11 years, and it deserves to go to someone who'll be honest back." Truett nodded. He understood, or he understood enough. The price was $3,800. Clem had paid $4,200 11 years before. The $400 difference represented the cost of ownership over 11 seasons, which was the smallest number Bertie had ever written in the column that tracked what things cost them. Wendell helped load the machine onto Truett's flatbed that afternoon. Clem stood at the barn door and watched Truett Sisson drive the 1964 John Deere 45 out of the Braddock yard and down the lane and out onto the county road, and he watched until the machine was out of sight. Wendell stood beside him. "Do you feel anything?" Wendell asked. He was 27 now, broad-shouldered like his father, with the same watchful quality in his face. Clem thought about it honestly. I feel like it's going where it needs to go, he said, same as it came here when it needed to. Wendell was quiet for a moment, then he said, I've been thinking about what you told me when I was a kid, that I'd see. And Clem said, I see, Wendell said. They stood at the barn door for a while longer, looking at the empty lane. Then Clem turned and went back into the barn to begin the work of receiving the new machine, because there was always work and the work was always the answer. Odell Bigham gave an interview to the Harlan County Historical Society in 2003, recorded on cassette by a retired school teacher who was compiling oral histories of county agriculture. When the interviewer asked him about memorable auctions in his career, Odell talked for a long time before he arrived at March 14, 1987, and when he did arrive at it, he chose his words carefully. I've thought about that sale more than any other in 31 years, Odell said, not because of the number. The number came later, and the number was remarkable, but that's not what stays with me. What stays with me is the silence after the bid. 30 people who had all made their decision, and one man whose decision was different. And I've spent a long time trying to understand the difference, and I think I finally know what it is. Every one of those 30 people was asking whether that machine was worth putting money into. Clem Braddock was asking what that machine could do if somebody was willing to do the work. Those are not the same question. They look like the same question from the outside, but they are looking in completely different directions. Bertie Braddock found the notebook on the kitchen table one evening in the fall of 2003, placed there by Wendell, who had been going through the writing desk and had set it out without quite deciding to leave it there permanently. She sat down and opened it and turned through the pages slowly. She had seen it before briefly, years ago. This time she read it differently. She read the dates, the September entries from the first disassembly, the October entries when the housing problem became clear. The winter entries, shorter, more compressed, written in the particular hand of a man who is tired but not yet willing to stop. The April entry that said only pump valve failure, order replacement, and then the May entry in a hand that looked slightly different from all the others, looser, not written by the same quality of containment. The machine runs. 3 words. The same 3 words she had written alone in this kitchen 16 years earlier at the bottom of her own private accounting, the list of everything they could lose. Except hers had been a question and his was an answer, and the answer had taken 14 months and every dollar of their reserve and more patience than she had known either of them possess to produce. She set the notebook down on the table and sat with it for a while. Wendell came in from the hallway and saw her sitting with the notebook. I found it in the desk, he said. I thought you might want it. It's your father's, she said. I know. Wendell sat down across from her. He told me the story once, after the machine left. Short version. What did he say? Wendell thought for a moment, getting the words right, which was something Clem had always done, and which Wendell had learned by watching. He said everyone in that lot was looking at the same machine. He said he just looked longer than they did. Bertie looked at her son. She had known Clem Braddock for 35 years by then, had shared a kitchen table and a set of account books and a piece of land with him through every season. The county had produced good ones and hard ones, and the kind that defied categorization. She knew him better than she knew any living person, and she knew that what he had said to Wendell was the most compressed version of something much larger, the way he always compressed things, the way he had always believed that the essential truth of anything could be reduced to its simplest and most honest form without losing what mattered. But she also knew what the short version left out. It left out the 23 letters she had carried to the post office. It left out the February night she had carried a stool into the coal barn and sat beside a man who was running out of certainty and offered him nothing except her continued presence. It left out the composition notebook with the list she had never shown him and the column of numbers that had grown past any point she had imagined possible when she was keeping them. It left out the way she had stood at the barn door on a May morning and gripped the frame with her right hand when the engine finally caught the single physical acknowledgement she had allowed herself for 14 months of choosing to believe in something she could not be sure of. The short version left all of that out. But the short version was right. That was the thing about Clem Braddock's short versions. They were always right. They were just not complete. And the complete version, the version that included everything the short one left out, was not his story to tell. It was hers. She pushed the notebook across the table to Wendell. "Keep it somewhere you can see it," she said. Wendell picked it up. "Where did you keep the financial records?" "In the desk," she said, "same drawer." Wendell looked at the notebook in his hands. "He kept his numbers and you kept yours." "That's right." And together they told the whole thing. Bertie looked at her son for a moment. He was in the ways that mattered very much his father, which meant he was also in the ways his father had never fully recognized very much hers. "Yes," she said. Together they did. Wendell put the notebook on the table in front of him and left it there. Not in a drawer, on the table where he could see it. It stayed there through every season that followed through the years, when he ran the farm alone and expanded it incrementally with the same patience his father had brought to everything, never moving faster than the ground could support, never committing more than the honest accounting justified. The 94 acres that Clem's grandfather had cleared from hardwood timber at the beginning of the century were still planted. The creek still ran cold through the lower pasture. The equipment bay in the main barn, the space that had been cleared out to receive a rusting machine on a borrowed flatbed in the early spring of 1987, held whatever machine was currently in service. And the machine was always in service because that was the kind of farm this was and the kind of family that ran it. The composition notebook with Bertie's records lived in the desk drawer. The mechanical notebook with Clem's serial number and 3 decades of precise handwriting sat on Wendell's work table into whatever page had been last consulted. Not a trophy, a tool, the same thing it had always been. Some knowledge lives in institutions, and some lives in libraries, and some lives in the hands and the ears, in the particular patience of people who spent their lives paying attention to things the world had already decided to walk away from. The machine that 30 experienced people had declared worthless on a cold March morning had run for 11 seasons across 9 farms and had returned multiples of its cost and had kept a family's land in their name through the hardest decade American agriculture had seen in a generation. It had done all of this because one man had been willing to lie down in the gravel. And because one woman had been willing to sit down in the cold. Neither of them had done it alone. That was the whole of the thing. That was the part the short version left out. And it was in the end the most important part of all.